I'm Julie Herman of J. Brick Holtz and Lazy Girl Designs, and welcome back to the Gravity Sew Along. Now that we have cut out all of our pieces for block 1, it's time to begin piecing our block. If you have not yet seen the cutting video, I suggest you start there. The link can be found in the caption below. Now that I have finished cutting out all of my pieces for block 1, I went ahead and laid them out following the diagram on the bottom of page 12, and I did it on a cutting mat so that I'd be able to bring it over here to my sewing machine and not lose track of anything. We are going to work on sewing this together in rows, as I mentioned, so each of the rows, and then we'll sew the rows together to complete the block. So I like to begin in the top left, so I'm going to take these two pieces to start with, and I'm going to show you how I'm going to align them so that they end up exactly how I want them. Now I want the result to be, when they're sewn together, that I have a straight line here and a straight line here. And having those points cut off of the tips of my diamonds is really going to help. If I didn't have those cut off, I wouldn't know exactly where to align things, and you could end up sewing things together, and then when they're sewn together, you have it kind of offset. It happens. So if you have not cut the points off, I highly suggest it. So once you have those points cut off, you take your pieces and you place them right sides together, and because we have those cut off, we know exactly where to align it. So bring it up nice and close to the camera so you can see. So right here, we were just going to line this up on top of this one and this one on top of this one. And you can pin if you'd like to. I generally don't pin at this stage when I just have two pieces, but if you find it helpful to pin, go ahead and do that. I do like to start my machine on what I call a leader ender, so just a scrap of fabric. I find that it helps to avoid getting that nest of threads when you start sewing end up on your piece. So I just did a couple stitches onto the scrap here. And then I'm going to begin to sew onto here. So let me show you what that looks like. And where my needle is, I have a 1/4 inch foot. If you don't have a foot, just mark on your machine or do what it works best for you to know where your 1/4 inch is. But my needle should be going in right at that point. So it's kind of hard to see because it's the underpiece, but my needle should be going in at that point, and then it should finish at this point. And then if you need help holding things in place, you can use a stiletto. They're very helpful so that you don't get your finger itself too close to the machine. Never want to injure yourself. I'm just going to chain piece, so I'm going to take the next two. I have the last two pieces from my first row, and then I'll sew back onto a scrap and take those off and show you what it looks like. And as you can see, once we press, it'll be nice and straight here and nice and straight there, and same with this piece. It can be very easy to get things turned around and end up sewing them not in the orientation in which you had them planned. So I do find it helpful to take my pieces and constantly go back to my little design wall, in this case my cutting mat here, and lay them out, and so that I know that I'm keeping my pieces in the right order. And so now that I know which way I need these two, and it's that I want to sew this to this, I'm going to go ahead and I can finish sewing this row. And I'm going to begin to sew the next row, and then I'll take that first row off and show you what it looks like. And you'll notice here that I'm not doing any back stitching. All of these seams will eventually be crossed with other seams within this block or when the block gets sewn into the bigger quilt. If you find you have a problem with your seams unraveling, you can go ahead and backstitch. So this is now my completed first row. And what I'd like to do before I head on over to the iron is I'd like to open up my seams just with my nail, kind of finger press them open. And that way I can just double check and make sure that everything is looking really good and that I am straight across here and there, which will help when I go to put my next row on. So as I mentioned, I like to finger press these open. And one quick tip on pressing, you want to make sure that when you get your ironing board out, that you are pressing and not ironing. The difference is when you are ironing, you are moving your iron back and forth, which can distort bias, and pressing is just up and down. You are moving the weight of your iron when it is not on the fabric. We want to go and we want to press, which is up and down. You can do a little bit of a wiggle, generally with your hand off so there's not extra weight, but you don't want to be pushing because that can distort your fabric, and that is best practice to kind of establish with all quilting, but especially when you're cutting with things like this. So I like to press, and then I often like to go from the front as well so that things are nice and flat. I want to show you a tip for sewing the rows together. So I'm going to jump ahead, and I have already sewn my orange rows together. So you would continue sewing your green ones, and then this is the next step. Now that I have these sewn and nice and pressed, when sewing these two rows together, you can align your outside corners. And then I'm going to show you some landmarks to keep an eye on to help align things here. And then one more trick. So we're going to place those right sides together. And this is where I will use pins. And our outsides are going to look very similar to when we sewed two diamonds together. So we're just going to align that with the point that we trimmed off. And up here with the point that we trimmed off. And now for our center three locations, what we're going to look for is we're going to use the fact that we pressed these seams open to our advantage. And we're going to line up this seam that comes here. Let me show you this one. I think it's easier, the contrast of the two colors, to see this one. Okay, so we're going to look at this seam is going to align with the edge of this that is pressed open. And that is what it looks like if I kind of pull it down. So if you push it up, that point kind of aligns there. And then the same on the other side, this pressed open aligns with this one. So we're going to line those up and place a pin. And I'm going to repeat that for all three of my intersections. And then I could just go ahead and sew the length of this piece. That is one option. What I prefer to do is what I like to call thread pinning. And what that is that I am going to sew about 1/2 inch on either side of the intersection, just about 1 inch at a time, and take it off and take a look at them. And what that's going to enable me to do is, if one of these is off, I'm just going to have to take out the stitches at that one location and not the length of my piece. And it does take a little bit more time, but I find that more often I will catch my mistakes this way, and so the time is a trade-off in that I'm not having to take out the stitches in the full length of the piece. So let me show you what that looks like. I'm just going to sew about 1/2 inch on either one, and I'm not back stitching. And again, just about 1/2 inch on either one. And I'm taking my pins out as I go. You never want to sew over pins. It's not good for your machine, and they could also break a needle, fly up at you. Okay. So let's take this off and take a look at these. So back onto my scrap. I'm just going to snip these threads so that I'll be able to lay this flat. Okay. So I still have my pins on my corners, but I'm going to open it up and see how I did. And that one's off by a tiny bit. That one's pretty good, and that one's pretty good. So I like what that looks like, but I don't really like that one. I feel like I could do a better job. If I took a more generous seam allowance, I could get them to line up, but then that's not necessarily what I want to do. I don't want to sew a larger seam allowance because I want things to line up later down the road. So I'm just going to double check. That's good. That's good. This is the one I want to take out. Now I have my seam ripper, and I've only got about 8-10 threads, 8-10 stitches, I should say, here to quickly take out. I'm just going to do every other one, and that should be enough. And then I'll be able to realign this and try again, and it saves me time because I don't have to take out the full length of this. And you can decide what's your margin of error, how far off is too off in your book to decide that you want to rearrange things. In the first time I sewed this, I was on this side. I know that because my pins are here. And sometimes I find flipping it to the back, I will have more success doing it the second time from the back. Not exactly sure why. I don't think there is a scientific reason here, but sometimes I just find that it works a little bit better. So I'm going to flip to this side and give it a go, and let's see how it turns out this time. And back onto my scrap. And much better. That is darn near perfect this time. So I will now go ahead and sew the length of this piece, starting with where my pin is and ending with my pin and using my thread as my pins in the middle. And I'm not going to backstitch in the beginning or the end of this because these seams will eventually get intersected when I sew my block to my next block. But if you're worried about things coming apart while you just have your blocks together, you can backstitch at the beginning and the end of the length of this seam, since this will be a seam that will not get crossed over until we are adding it to another block in completing our quilt, which is towards the end of this project. And this is just month 1 that we're getting started on. So let's take this off and see how it looks. And that looks great. So I will go ahead and finger press that open, and then I will fully press it open, but I don't need to do that yet. I can just go ahead and grab my next piece, which is this one, and flip it on top and do the same thing, and complete sewing this row and my 4th to complete my block. Thanks for watching. If this video was helpful for you, be sure to like it, leave a comment below, and subscribe to the channel. Show us your progress on your gravity blocks in our Facebook group. We'd love to see how you're coming along with your quilt. The link to the Facebook group is below. I'll be back here in the next video to show you how to do cutting for block 2.